Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to revisit the Heroes system, specifically Heroes of Stalingrad. And the reason I'm doing this is because while I did do a very brief video introduction a while ago as to how the game plays using one of the smaller scenarios, there were two things that slightly dissatisfied me about it. Now one of them is that the small scenario, which only took up two of these map squares, doesn't really give you a sense of the grandeur and scope of either Heroes of Stalingrad or Heroes of Normandy, come to think of it. So the purpose of this video and the ones that will follow is to give you a perspective on how big this game can get, yet retaining a degree of simplicity of play. So all that really increases is the scale. And you do, of course, have to keep track of more units. But in terms of additional rules and that sort of thing, the complexity doesn't really change a whit, which to my mind is a great advantage. The other reason I wanted to do this video is, and this is no reflection on the game, I was a bit underwhelmed by the performance of the Germans in the demonstration video. Now that was not their fault. It was an object lesson to me in using an AI system that I'd cobbled together for the likes of games like Panzer Grenadier. And I'm afraid working on the blithe assumption that it would always work well in other game systems proved to be a bit erroneous. So I'm going to try and play this one through a bit more competitively. And so what I'm going to try and do this time is, instead of relying on an AI system per se, I'm going to play both sides as honestly as I can and see how I do. Now, I don't yet have the solo system that has been brought in by the designers of this game. So I'd be interested to hear any thoughts from those of you who have had a chance to trial it exhaustively. Um, I suppose the burning question really is it worth the investment? Does it add much to the enjoyment of the game? Is it a good solitaire system? I really want to try it out for myself, but if you have any comments, I'd really love to know. So this scenario, this enormous beast of a scenario, is called Extreme Makeover, Home Edition. Typical of the slightly tongue-in-cheek titles the designers have come up with for all the Stalingrad scenarios. And essentially the victory objectives are quite different in this one. So we have a very big German setup on this side of the map and the Soviets on the other side. But the objective for both sides, I'm going to zoom in a bit here so you can see it clearly, is this very large house in the center of the map. So the job of the Soviets is, over the course of a 6-turn scenario, they are supposed to seize and hold this house and prevent the Germans from destroying it. The Germans' orders are relatively simple. They are to destroy this structure completely, not occupy it. Their high command just wants it leveled. And just to show you how this can be done, of course they'll be attempting it during the game, but as you can see, it's a 2-part structure, and it has a structure defense rating. If the Germans score enough hits on it, it gets flipped over to its destroyed side. And while the Russians and the Soviets, I should say, can still occupy it and fight from the rubble, effectively it's counted as a loss because the defensive feature that they were supposed to have seized has been, I suppose, not rendered completely ineffective, but for whatever reason the Soviet High Command wanted an intact house rather than one that had been reduced to rubble. So that is the objective that's being fought over. The forces, as ever, are interestingly asymmetrical. In terms of units, the Germans have a slightly weaker force, and they have inferior armour, as unfortunately they often do in this game. But they have an awful lot of logistical backup. I'll just see if I can get a bit closer for you. There we go. So they have very good leadership. They have got one more one more orders token than the Soviets do. They've got very good logistical support in terms of extra weapons. And most importantly, the Germans begin with all their units on the map. The Soviets, by contrast, have good armour, plentiful infantry, but all the units on this row here, the Siberian Rifle Battalion, do not begin the game on the board. They arrive as reinforcements on turn 3. So the Soviets really are starting off on a bit of a weaker footing. Now, I'll have a close look at some of the deployments. The Russian setup has been a little bit more higgledy-piggledy because they have an enormous setup area in this scenario, essentially from the wall of the objective house all the way back to the edge of the board. So the way I've set them up has been deliberately chaotic because they know there's Germans in the area, but they're not entirely sure where they are. So juggling the various necessities of having an armoured reserve nearby, having enough infantry in the vicinity to try and take the house in the first place, but at the same time having enough of a reserve further back to be able to commit as reinforcements and also to cover all bases, because there's a lot of ruined buildings around here and there's quite a few terrain features that offer cover. So for all its impressiveness on the order of battle, the Soviet force is actually stretched quite thin. Now, the infantry are fairly well spread around. I possibly could have put their heavy weapons a bit further forward. So there's a mortar deployed in the crater over there. But the range is good and they have eyes forward. So hopefully they can make use of that. There is a heavy machine gun on standby in those ruins, which is also ready to move forward once positions have been consolidated. Now, the real heavy hitter for the Soviets is Maria with her T-34 down there with some infantry backing her up. Now, the idea of this little force here is to occupy the house. I'll say it's just to the south of the objective, because from there they can use it to stiffen the defense of the house. And also, looking at the terrain, it's probably best to have the tank initially under cover, but make sure that there's enough clear terrain for it to be able to move around and try to deal with any threats that develop from this direction. The Soviets, of course, have to set up first in this scenario, which for them, as ever with these things, is a bit of a disadvantage. So they've had to guess the Germans' intentions. The Germans, by contrast, if I can come round, have effectively divided their forces in two. So there is a very strong infantry contingent with supporting weapons, which has occupied some of the ruined buildings on the western side of the map. Their deployment prevented them from moving too far forward and seizing that building. Otherwise, that would have been a bit too useful. If I zoom out, of course, there's the house to the south of the ones the Russians have to defend, and the one that they're hoping to seize as a strong point to bolster the defence of this place. And over on the German left is a very powerful concentration of guns and armour. Now, the reason I've done this, including the very unusual arrangement of the two anti-tank guns close together, is that the most efficient way for the Germans to carry out their orders is to have their heavy ordnance come forward along the easiest axis of advance and take out the house. Now, this makes life very easy for them. All of those vehicles have means of getting past the structures nearby and being able to bring their guns to bear on the house. And of course, the guns, the anti-tank guns have a somewhat more limited range of movement, but it won't take them very long to get into position. The Germans are aware that they've only got 6 turns in which to bring that house down, so it's not a lot of time. In a way, the Russians have the easier job, because they just have to make sure that house is still standing, at least in part, by the end of turn 6. The onus for destroying it is on the Germans. And most significantly, if I revisit their order of battle, you can see that they have no specialized demolitions equipment. There's all the regular stuff, but their infantry are really just equipped for killing off their own kind and possibly some heavier things. But grenades don't really cut it when it comes to bringing structures down. So the Germans are going to have to use their armor to accomplish the mission. Now the danger for them is that if they allow the Russians to destroy their armor or even cripple their armor force, then they're in trouble. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this scenario shapes up. In the following videos, I will be doing a full turn-by-turn playthrough from start to finish, I hope at any rate, and we will see how things go. And over the course of this, I hope that we'll not only cover some of the features that we did in my previous video on the Heroes system and how it works, but also maybe even see some new things, perhaps some more effective infantry armor cooperation, and some of the quirks of both the Soviet and the German heroes and special characters. On the Soviet side, excuse me. On the Soviet side, we have Maria Oktyabrskaya. I hope I've pronounced that properly. Not so much a tank ace as a genius at keeping them going. And of course the sniper Tanya Chernova. And on the German side, we have Oberst Hermann Hoth providing the overall leadership, and Steiner, the good old solid Feldwebel, providing, I suppose, a fair amount of backbone to the troops. He's a good all-rounder. He's got quite an impressive skill set. So we shall see how this goes. I look forward to the playthrough. Thank you for joining me for, I suppose we'd call this the pre-mission briefing before the bullets start flying. It's very good to see you all, as always. A big thank you to my regulars for joining me. If any of you are visiting the channel for the first time, and this is your first video, a very warm welcome to you. Please do check out the other videos if you'd like to, specifically for the Heroes system, or indeed anything else that catches your fancy. So, always appreciate your company, everyone, and until the bullets start metaphorically flying, thank you very much for tuning in.